The bell above the door of the Silver Spoon Diner was supposed to jingle. It was a cheerful, tinny sound that announced the arrival of regulars looking for coffee refills or families seeking a booth for a late lunch. But when the door opened that Tuesday afternoon, the sound was different. It was swallowed by the sudden, heavy presence that filled the doorway, a presence that seemed to pull all the noise in the room towards it and snuff it out. Forks paused halfway to mouths. The sizzle of burgers on the griddle seemed to quiet. Conversations, once a bubbling stew of local gossip and complaints about the weather, evaporated into a tense, watchful silence. Lena felt the shift before she saw it. It was a drop in atmospheric pressure, a prickling on the back of her neck that told her the diner's easy rhythm had just been broken. She was wiping down the chrome counter, the scent of ammonia and stale coffee clinging to the damp rag in her hand. At 23, she moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long hours and little rest, her light blue uniform a stark contrast to the weariness that sometimes settled deep in her bones. She looked up, her eyes following the collective gaze of the patrons, and saw him. He was a man who did not belong in a place of cracked vinyl seats and sticky menus. His suit was a dark, immaculate gray, tailored so precisely it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin. His posture was unnervingly still, his face a study in disciplined neutrality. But it wasn't just the man that had frozen the room. It was the animal standing at his side, its powerful, muscular frame a solid block of gray stone. A Pitbull. Its head was massive, its jaw set, and its eyes, a pale, intelligent amber, scanned the room with the same calm, assessing gaze as its owner. The dog wore a simple, thick leather collar but no leash. It didn't need one. It moved in perfect sync with the man, a silent, four-legged shadow of controlled power. The sight was so incongruous, so utterly out of place, that the diner's occupants seemed to forget how to breathe. This was a place for service animals, the occasional fluffy poodle peeking from a purse, not a creature that looked like it could tear through steel. The man's gaze swept across the room, missing nothing, and for a moment, it landed on Lena. It was a brief, impersonal glance, but she felt the weight of it, the unnerving sense that he saw more than just a waitress in a pale blue dress. He was cataloging exits, threats, and faces, his mind working with a quiet, lethal efficiency. The manager, Sal, a man whose anxiety was a constant, low-grade fever, scurried out from the kitchen, wiping his sweaty palms on his apron. His face was pale, his eyes wide with the panicked need to enforce the "No Pets Allowed" sign taped to the door, a rule he was suddenly terrified to mention. He approached the man, his steps faltering as he got closer. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The man, who hadn't moved an inch, simply held Sal's gaze. He didn't smile, didn't threaten, didn't do anything at all, yet the effect was profound. Sal's resolve crumbled into a puddle of nervous sweat. He gave a weak, jerky nod, as if granting permission that had never been asked for, and then retreated back toward the relative safety of the kitchen, muttering about health codes to no one in particular. The man, his silent victory complete, began to move. He walked toward a corner booth, the one that offered a clear view of the entire diner and the front door. The Pitbull padded silently beside him, its claws making no sound on the worn linoleum floor. The patrons, released from their initial shock, began to whisper. The words were quiet but ugly, fueled by fear and prejudice. Mafia, someone hissed from a nearby table. Look at the dog. Definitely Yakuza. Another speculated, their cinematic stereotypes rushing in to fill the vacuum of understanding. They didn't see a man, they saw a threat, a caricature from a movie, and they judged him instantly and completely. Lena watched it all unfold from her station behind the counter. She saw the fear, the whispers, the way the other two waitresses, Brenda and Chloe, suddenly became intensely interested in refilling sugar dispensers and polishing silverware, their movements carefully choreographed to keep them as far away from the corner booth as possible. Brenda caught her eye and gave a subtle shake of her head, a clear warning. Don't go over there. It's not worth the tip. Lena understood the fear. The man radiated an aura of danger that was as tangible as the heat from the griddle. But she also saw something else. She saw a customer, A man sitting alone in a room full of people who had already tried and convicted him based on nothing more than his suit, his face, and his dog. A profound sense of professional duty, a stubborn refusal to be intimidated, stirred within her. It was her section. He was her customer. It was as simple and as complicated as that. She ignored Brenda's warning glance and the low murmur of the room. She picked up a laminated menu, its corners soft and curled with age, and a glass of ice water that beaded with condensation under the warm diner lights. Taking a steadying breath, she started the long walk across the floor, each step feeling deliberate and heavy, as if she were wading through the thick, collective anxiety of the room. The whispers died down as she approached, replaced by a new, more focused silence. Every eye in the diner was on her. They watched her, a lone figure in a faded blue dress, walking toward the corner where the monster from their imagination sat waiting. Mr. Han, as he would later be known, did not look up immediately. He was adjusting the collar of his shirt, a small, precise movement. The dog, however, was alert. It lay beneath the table, but its head was raised, its ears twitching, tracking her approach. Its amber eyes were fixed on her, unblinking. Lena reached the table and placed the water glass down on the formica surface. The small clink of glass on plastic sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. "Welcome to the Silver Spoon," she said, her voice even and calm, betraying none of the tension she felt. "My name is Lena. I'll be your server today." She placed the menu next to the glass, her movements smooth and practiced. It was a simple, professional courtesy, an act she performed 100 times a day. But in this charged atmosphere, it felt like a declaration. A small act of defiance against the fear that had paralyzed everyone else. He finally lifted his head, and his eyes met hers. They were dark and intense, and for a second, she saw a flicker of surprise in them. He hadn't expected to be served. He had expected to be ignored, feared, and eventually asked to leave. Just as he was about to speak, a strange sound came from under the table. It was a low, guttural noise, a deep vibration that seemed to come from the Pitbull's chest. It wasn't a growl of aggression. It was something else entirely, a sound of confusion, of longing, of a memory struggling to surface. The dog pushed its massive head out from under the table, its brow furrowed. It stared at Lena, its gaze locked on her face with an unnerving intensity. Its tail, thick and powerful, gave a single, hesitant thump against the red vinyl of the booth. The sound was soft, almost lost in the hum of the refrigerator, but to Lena, it was deafening. The dog whined again, a soft, questioning sound, and took a clumsy step forward, stretching its neck to sniff at the hem of her dress. Lena froze, her hand still resting on the back of the opposite booth. The animal wasn't threatening. It was hopeful. There was a desperate, pleading quality in its eyes that she couldn't comprehend. It was looking at her as if it knew her, as if it had been waiting for her. A strange, disquieting feeling washed over her, a sense of déjà vu so strong it made the hairs on her arms stand on end. She felt a connection to this animal, a phantom limb of a memory she couldn't quite grasp. Mr. Han's focus shifted instantly from Lena to the dog. He watched the animal's bizarre behavior, his stoic expression replaced by one of deep, controlled curiosity. His dog, Ghost, was a model of discipline and restraint. Trained for protection, it was aloof and indifferent to strangers, tolerant but never friendly. It had never, in the 5 years it had been with him, shown this kind of spontaneous, emotional interest in anyone. "He seems to like you," Mr. Han said, his voice a low baritone with the ghost of a Korean accent. His eyes were sharp, analytical, moving from the dog's pleading face back to Lena's. He wasn't just making small talk. He was searching for an explanation, a missing piece to a puzzle he didn't know existed until this very moment. Lena looked down at the Pitbull, truly meeting its gaze. The amber eyes held an intelligence that was almost human, and within their depths, she saw a flicker of something familiar, a ghost of a shared past that made no sense. On pure instinct, she slowly lowered her hand. The dog didn't flinch. Instead, it leaned forward, pressing its broad, warm head into her palm with a sigh of contentment, closing its eyes as if savoring a long-lost sensation. The contact sent a jolt through her, a current of inexplicable recognition. Mr. Han observed the interaction with an unnerving stillness. He watched the way her fingers gently stroked the dog's scarred head, the way her thumb naturally found the soft spot behind its ear. Her touch was not the tentative pat of a stranger, but the confident, familiar caress of someone who knew the animal intimately. His gaze narrowed, focusing on her hands. They were slender but strong, her nails cut short and practical. He was looking for something specific, a scar, a tattoo, any mark that might connect her to a life beyond this diner. "Have you worked with dogs before?" he asked, his tone casual but the question loaded with unspoken weight. He was testing her, probing for a reaction. Lena pulled her hand back, a sudden wave of caution washing over her. The moment had felt too personal, too strange. She straightened up, her professional mask sliding back into place. "A little," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. "Here and there. I like animals." It was a vague, dismissive answer, designed to shut down the conversation. She didn't want to talk about her past. That part of her life was buried, locked away for a reason. "Can I get you something to start with?" "Coffee?" she asked, trying to steer the encounter back to the safe, predictable script of server and customer. But he was not to be deterred. He completely ignored her question, his attention fixed on the mystery unfolding before him. The menu lay unopened on the table. The coffee was irrelevant. "My dog is very particular," he said, his voice quiet but insistent, drawing her back in. "He is loyal. He is disciplined. But he does not trust easily. He has never responded to a stranger this way." He leaned forward slightly in the booth, his presence seeming to fill the small space. He was studying her face now, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. He noticed things that others missed, the faint, silvery white scar that cut through her right eyebrow, almost perfectly concealed by the arch of her hair. He saw the ingrained stillness in her posture, a kind of coiled readiness that was at odds with the tired slump of a typical waitress. It was the posture of someone trained to wait, to watch, to endure. She held herself with an unconscious authority that this cheap uniform couldn't hide. A new question formed in his mind, sharp and specific. Lena, feeling his scrutiny, shifted her weight, her discomfort growing. She looked down at the dog, who was still staring at her with that same heartbreaking hope. To deflect, she asked, "What's his name?" It felt safer to focus on the animal. "His name is Ghost," Mr. Han replied, watching her face for the slightest reaction. "Does that name mean anything to you?" The name hit her like a physical blow. Ghost. For a split second, the clatter and smells of the diner vanished, replaced by a phantom sensation of choking dust, the blinding glare of a foreign sun, and the deafening roar of an engine. A memory, sharp and violent, tried to break through the walls she had so carefully built around it. She saw a flash of a different uniform, khaki and heavy, and felt the familiar weight of a rifle in her hands. The moment passed as quickly as it came. She blinked, forcing herself back to the present, to the sticky floor and the smell of frying onions. "No," she said, her voice a little too tight, a little too quick. "No, it doesn't. It's a cool name for a dog," though she offered a small, brittle smile, but her eyes betrayed her. The lie hung in the air between them, thin and fragile. He knew she was lying, and she knew that he knew. The dynamic had shifted. This was no longer a waitress serving a customer. It was an interrogation, quiet and relentless, and she was losing control of it. The diner patrons watched, mesmerized, sensing the invisible currents of history and pain that were now swirling in that corner booth. Mr. Han did not press her on the lie. Instead, he chose a different path, one that was far more effective. He relaxed back into the booth, his posture deceptively casual, but his eyes never left her face. "Ghost was not always my dog," he began, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone, forcing her to lean in slightly to hear him over the diner's hum. "He belonged to a soldier. A very brave American soldier." Each word was carefully chosen, a key being inserted into a lock. The word soldier made Lena's hand clench around the small notepad in her pocket. She could feel the edges of the paper digging into her palm. The sounds of the diner began to recede, replaced by a low ringing in her ears. He continued, his gaze unwavering, pinning her in place. This soldier saved my life. And the lives of my men. It was in Afghanistan. A dusty little outpost near Kandahar province. The name of the province was a hammer blow. Kandahar. The dust, the heat, the constant, grinding fear. It was all rushing back now, a tidal wave of memory she was powerless to stop. Her carefully constructed dam of forgetting was crumbling. Her composure, her greatest defense, was beginning to crack. The pen she held in her hand trembled, a small, violent tremor that traveled up her arm. She could see it all with horrifying clarity. The sun-baked earth, the concertina wire, the oppressive weight of her body armor. She could smell the acrid scent of diesel fumes and the metallic tang of blood in the air. The faces of her squad mates flashed before her eyes. Mr. Hans saw the change in her. He saw the color drain from her face, the slight parting of her lips as her breathing hitched. He knew he was close. He was a military working dog, he said, and this time it was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a truth laid bare on the Formica tabletop. A patrol and explosive detection dog. His handler, she was a woman. Young, but very calm under fire. He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of his words sink in. There was an ambush. An IED. She was wounded. Badly. We were told she did not make it. The final words landed with devastating force. Did not make it. Lena's vision blurred. The lie they had told him mirrored the lie they had told her. The diner, the customers, Sal peeking nervously from the kitchen window, it all faded into an indistinct, watery backdrop. The only real things in the world were the man in the booth, the dog at her feet, and the ghost of the woman she used to be. Lena's breath hitched in her throat, a choked, painful sound. The past was no longer a memory. It was a physical presence, wrapping around her, squeezing the air from her lungs. She lowered her gaze from Mr. Hans' face to the dog. She looked at him now not as a stranger's pet, but as a part of her own soul she thought she had lost forever. Her eyes traced the lines of his familiar, blocky head. And then she saw it. A small, thin, silvery scar just over his left eye, partially hidden in the short gray fur. A scar from a piece of shrapnel that had ricocheted off a Humvee. A scar she had cleaned and stitched herself in the frantic, terrifying moments after an explosion, her hands steady despite the chaos erupting around them. His name, she said, her voice a raw, broken whisper that was barely audible. It wasn't Ghost. It was Titan at the sound of the name. The dog's entire body went rigid. A deep, mournful whine escaped its throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated grief and recognition. He surged forward, pushing his entire body against her legs, his head burying itself into her stomach. He was trembling, making small, desperate noises. It was the sound of a partner who had mourned, who had waited, who had never given up hope. He had found his person. A collective gasp went through the diner. The few remaining whispers ceased entirely. Mr. Hans' carefully maintained composure finally shattered. The mask of stoic control fell away, revealing a raw, profound astonishment. His eyes widened, and he stared at Lena as if seeing her for the first time. The quiet waitress in the pale blue uniform vanished, and in her place stood someone else entirely. You, he breathed, the word heavy with disbelief and awe. You were his handler? Sergeant Lena Washington. He knew her name. He had memorized it from the after-action reports, the name of the soldier who was listed as killed in action, the hero he had been searching for. Lena could only nod, tears finally breaking free and streaming down her face. She couldn't speak. The memories were a torrent now. The grueling training at Lackland, the bond forged in the dust of a war zone, the silent language they shared, the absolute trust. She remembered the IED, the searing heat, the world turning upside down. She remembered waking up in a hospital in Germany, disoriented and in agony, being told that her partner, her Titan, had been killed in the blast. They told her he had shielded her, saving her life at the cost of his own. They had given her a box of ashes and a medal, a hollow exchange for a living, breathing piece of her heart. The weight of that 5-year-old lie and the sudden, miraculous truth was overwhelming. Mr. Hahn watched the silent, emotional reunion, his own eyes glistening. He began to speak, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. He explained how his private security convoy had been caught in the same ambush as her unit. How, in the chaotic aftermath, his men had found Titan standing guard over one of his wounded men, refusing to leave his side even as gunfire echoed around them. "We thought his handler was gone," he explained, his voice resonating in the now sacred silence of the room. "The army medics, they told us you were Kia. We took him in. I owed you that much." I owed him that much. He had tried to find her family, to return the dog, but the official records listed her as having no next of kin. So he had kept him, renaming him Ghost in honor of the handler who had vanished. "I have searched for your family for years," he confessed, his gaze filled with a deep, humbling respect. "To tell them of your sacrifice. To thank you." Lena finally found her voice, fueled by a surge of anger at the betrayal she had endured. "They told me he was gone," she said, the words sharp with pain. "They told me he died in the blast. They gave me a different dog's ashes and told me to move on." The revelation hung in the air, a testament to bureaucratic cruelty and the deep wounds of war. The diner patrons were no longer just spectators. They were witnesses. The man they had pegged as a gangster was a man of honor, meticulously trying to repay a debt of life. The young woman they saw as just another tired waitress was a decorated war hero, a sergeant who had been robbed of her partner by a lie. The entire moral landscape of the room had been redrawn. Sal stood motionless behind the counter, the dirty rag still clutched in his hand, his mouth hanging open. The other waitresses, Brenda and Chloe, huddled together by the coffee machine, their faces etched with shame and awe. They had judged her, pitted her even, for being stuck in this dead-end job, never once suspecting the steel in her spine or the history she carried. Mr. Hahn slowly rose from his seat. He stood to his full height, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a military dress uniform. He faced Lena, and in a gesture of profound respect that was utterly alien to the setting of a greasy spoon diner, he bowed. It was not a small nod, but a deep, formal bow from the waist, a gesture reserved for saviors and sovereigns. "Sergeant Washington," he said, his voice clear and strong, ringing through the silent room. "Your partner is safe. He has been waiting for you." Lena finally knelt on the floor, ignoring the grime and the stairs. She wrapped her arms around Titan, burying her face in the thick, familiar fur of his neck. She breathed in his scent, a scent she thought she would never experience again. The dog, her Titan, whined softly, licking the tears from her cheeks, his whole body wriggling with a joy so pure it was painful to watch. It was a reunion 5 years in the making, a circle of grief and loss finally, impossibly, closed. The other customers looked down at their plates, at their hands, anywhere but at the scene that was unfolding. Their casual judgments, their whispered insults, now felt like sacrilege. They had been in the presence of quiet heroism and had been utterly blind to it. Lena eventually looked up, her tear-streaked face holding a newfound peace. Her eyes met Mr. Hahn's across the table. In that shared gaze, a silent understanding passed between them, an acknowledgement of shared trauma, of survival, and of the unbreakable bonds forged in the crucible of war. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a wallet, from which he slid a sleek, black credit card. He pushed it across the table. "For whatever you need," he said softly. "For his food, a vet, a new place to live. Anything." Lena looked at the card, a symbol of a world she had no interest in rejoining. She gently pushed it back toward him. "He just needs me," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She stood up, her movements no longer weary, but filled with purpose. Her posture had changed. She was no longer Lena the waitress, but Sergeant Washington, United States Army, K-9 handler. She reached down and unclipped Titan's leash from the table leg where Mr. Hahn had secured it. Holding it firmly in her hand, she turned. Together, a woman and her dog, a single, reunited entity, they walked toward the door. They didn't look back. They left behind a room full of stunned, humbled people and a powerful silence that spoke louder than any words ever could. The bell over the door jingled as they left, but this time, it sounded like a salute.